Well, it's fall.
And for our farmers, that means harvest season. At least I think that's what it means. I've spent most of my life living in farming communities. In fact, for the first 22 years of my life, I lived in a house whose backyard backed up to either a soybean field or a cornfield. But despite this, what I know about farming is actually quite limited. I do know that about this time of year my allergies flare up. I know that I usually see the corn disappear around this time of year. Occasionally, I'll even catch a farmer driving his or her big harvester, if that's what it's called. I have a lot of respect for our farmers. We're all dependent upon them. They have a very important and crucial job, and I've grown up around it. But I don't know much about it, even though I've grown up around it. And maybe Jesus could have said the same. He was a carpenter by trade, but he grew up in an agricultural society. Interestingly enough, he told a lot of stories that used farming to illustrate some kind of spiritual point. Maybe that was because he knew his audience. He wasn't a farmer, but a lot of the people who were listening to him were. Now, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be taking a look at 3 of Jesus' parables, 3 of the stories that he told that taught spiritual lessons. Now, each one of these stories somehow uses farming as an illustration for some universal, eternal truth that Jesus was trying to get across. Now, these stories appear in more than one of the 4 Gospels, sometimes in a few different versions. But the ones that we'll be taking a look at appear in the Gospel of Matthew. The one we're going to look at this Sunday appears in Matthew chapter 13, which starts off like this. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell along rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. Now, a little bit later in the same chapter, Jesus explains the meaning of this story to his disciples. He says this, he says, when anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy, but since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. So the seed that gets planted in this story is the word. That is the teaching about the kingdom that Jesus passed on to his first disciples, and they in turn have handed down through the generations to us. The different soils represents people's hearts. Each type of soil represents a certain response that the human heart can have to hearing the message of the kingdom. Simply put, the way that someone responds to the message of the kingdom of God says something about the state of their inner spiritual lives. Now, these illustrations should convict us in a couple of different ways, because we are, as the church, are responsible for the well-being of ourselves and for the spiritual well-being of those in our spheres of influence. Individually, we're each responsible for our own spiritual well-being, just as we have the responsibility to make sure we get the rest and the nourishment that we need. We have a responsibility to make sure that we get what we need spiritually. But we're also responsible for supporting the spiritual needs of those around us. Our families, our friends, our church family, our neighbors, our co-workers, to varying degrees, we are responsible to support the spiritual well-being of those God puts in our lives. So when we look at these different types of soil, we need to ask ourselves two questions. First of all, which category does my heart fall into? Ask yourself, which category of soil sounds like your heart? What obstacles do you struggle with? But we should also ask, how can someone, either you or someone else who is struggling to have a fruitful response to hearing the message of the kingdom, how can that person, either you or someone else, overcome those obstacles to growth, overcome those obstacles to fruitfulness? Well, in all honesty, that second question might be a little bit pushing the limits of what Jesus was trying to communicate through this parable. But as we look at what prevents growth in these different soils, we'll find that they aren't things that we're totally helpless to address. First of all, we have the seed that's scattered along the path. The soil on a path has been walked on over and over again by both humans and animals, so the ground is tightly packed. Any seed that's dropped there isn't going to go very deep. It's going to stay right on the surface where the birds can get it. Jesus explains that this scenario represents the person who doesn't understand the message. The message doesn't go very deep into their inner lives, and Satan or some other spiritual evil in his service snatches away what was sown in that person's heart. It never gets the chance to take root and produce fruit or produce results. There are two problems here that prevent growth. The primary problem is that the person doesn't understand the message. Assuming that the person doesn't have any cognitive disability or anything, the problem here is either with the communication of the message or the attitude of its receiver. And maybe the problem's both, some combination of the two. The communication of the message might not be clear to begin with. Maybe as we're trying to communicate the message of the kingdom, we're using languages and references that are unfamiliar to the listener. Maybe we're describing the message of Jesus in a way that she can't connect with. Of course, maybe the listener has too many biases, assumptions, or emotional barriers preventing him from really hearing the message with understanding. We can't really know a person's private thoughts, but getting to know him as a person might reveal some of it. Then, once we understand what those obstacles are, we can help him deal with it. We can help him overcome it. And the same goes for ourselves. If we don't understand something about the kingdom of God, about the message of Jesus, we should ask questions. We should seek understanding. We also need to be aware of our own biases, assumptions, and emotional barriers. Talking through those obstacles with a trusted Christian mentor, a pastor, or even a licensed counselor can help us overcome those obstacles. But there's another component to this situation where people's hearts are like the seeds scattered on the path, and this one is a spiritual one. While we're trying to make sense of the message of Jesus, that gives Satan a chance to swoop in and steal what hearing the message planted there in the first place. Now, the only way to deal with a spiritual problem like that is with a spiritual solution, and the best one in this situation is prayer. When we share the message of Jesus with someone else and try to help them through their confusion, we need to be praying that God will preserve what's already been planted in their hearts. And we need to do the same when we're the ones trying to find our way through confusion. We need to pray, perhaps with someone else we trust, that God will keep Satan from stealing what's been planted in our hearts. Now, the second type of soil was rocky soil. The seed planted there sprang up quickly and died quickly because it didn't have much in the way of roots. Jesus explains that this is the person who hears the message of Jesus, embraces it with enthusiasm, but gives up on the faith when trouble comes. The person's faith is a superficial faith. I had a professor in college who I respect greatly, but she once said something that troubles me to this day. She described religious belief as a trinket that you can place on your mantle and pick it up whenever you need it. Now, maybe I mistook her meaning, but it sounded to me like what she was describing was a superficial faith, one that you only pick up when it's convenient. But in order to have a deep and meaningful faith in Jesus, we have to work his nature and his teachings into every aspect of our lives. We have to work Jesus into every aspect of our lives, just like you would knead yeast into a lump of dough. But all too often, people embraced Christianity out of emotional enthusiasm, or they treat it like something they only pick up when they want to. People who come to Christianity out of an emotional response ride the waves of their feelings instead of digging deeper into their faith and rooting themselves into it. And when their emotions grow cold, they think it was all nonsense. This kind of superficial faith is why discipleship is so important. Let me be perfectly frank with you for a moment. If the only way you are nurturing your spiritual life is by coming to church on Sunday morning, even if you come every Sunday, your faith may very well be a superficial one. And when life experience comes along that challenges your faith, and it will, you may not be able to stand up in the face of it. And the solution to that, the way to make your faith stronger and more dependable, deeper and not so superficial, is discipleship. The solution is finding ways to root yourself in the Christian faith. Bible study, regular prayer, spiritual conversations. Heck, listening to Christian music will go a long way. Just don't listen during the week when they're fundraising. I turned on a Christian station for the first time in a long time this week, and wouldn't you know it, it was fundraiser week for them. I wanted to listen to Christian music. Anyway. But whatever you do, don't settle for a superficial faith. It'll fail you It'll fail you when you need it the most. Next, we have the seed that was sown among thorns. As Jesus explains, in these people's lives, the message of Jesus is unfruitful because two things get in the way. First, the worries of this life. These people let their concerns for earthly matters make them neglect spiritual matters. They're worried about their safety, their job security, their financial situations, their health, where their next meal will come from. And don't get me wrong, all of these things are important. They shouldn't be ignored or neglected, but when these things become more important to us than faithfully following Jesus, than living the life he's called to, that is a problem. That leads to unfruitfulness. The other thing that Jesus says leads to unfruitfulness is the deceitfulness of wealth. Do you remember what Jesus said about a rich man entering into the kingdom of God? He said it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Why is that? Because those who have all they need and want often feel like they don't need God. And even if they would never consciously say that, that's how they live. And they become attached to their comforts and their luxuries and don't want to give them up even when Jesus calls them to. Frankly, that's a pit that most of us in this country can fall into. The United States is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Even the poorest among us are still wealthier than 90% of the world. But we're also one of the greediest and most pampered nations in the world. I have a lot of strong words for the 1% in this country, but the rest of us, 99%, are just as vulnerable to the deceitfulness of wealth. We all are. Our attachment to what's comfortable and to the luxuries we enjoy often makes us unfruitful. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing inherently evil about comfort. There's nothing inherently evil about wealth or luxury. It is our attachment to it that is evil and is a stumbling block to fruitfulness in the Christian life. It's one of the reasons we fast, by the way. Every once in a while, we need to take a step back from the things we think we need in order to remember that our true dependence is upon God. Well, what if the problem isn't us? What if we're not the one in whose lives this obstacle is present? What if someone in our circle of influence is the one who's having the word planted in them choked out by the weeds of life? How do we help them? Well, if it's the worries of this life, we need to be their support system. We need to let God be their comfort through our expressions of His love. On the other hand, if it's the enticement of material wealth, well, that's a lot harder to deal with in someone else. If we have a strong and trusting relationship with that person, the right thing might be to respectfully and lovingly bring the problem to that other person's attention. But in the end, it often takes a radical loss for someone deceived by wealth to snap out of it. Finally, there's the seed that fell on the good soil. These people hear the message of Jesus, understand it. They let it take root deeper and deeper into their hearts and their lives produce fruit. Their lives produce results. Their lives and characters are transformed by the power of God, and they begin to reflect the character of Jesus. They're able to bear witness to His message through both what they say and what they do. And these are the people God uses to share His message with others. And that is what produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. The fact is, everyone sitting in this room has the potential to be like that final type of soil. We all face a choice as to what type of soil we will be. Will we allow our confusion to keep the message of Jesus from taking root in our hearts, or will we seek understanding? Will we settle for a superficial faith, or will we find ways to let our faith penetrate deeper and deeper into our hearts and lives? Will we allow the worries of this life or the deceitfulness of wealth to render our faith unfruitful, or will we choose to make our personal pursuit of the kingdom of God our priority over earthly matters or concerns of comfort? And when it comes to others who are struggling to receive the message of Jesus, will we leave them to their confusion, or will we help guide them through it? Will we rob them of opportunities to mature in their faith, or will we do everything to make sure they have that opportunity? Will we leave them to struggle alone in the face of life's struggles and temptations, or will we walk alongside them through it? May we all, first and foremost, be aware of the states of our own hearts. For we are primarily responsible for what goes on in our own hearts. But may we also not forget that we are also to some degree responsible for the spiritual well-being of those whom God puts in our lives. Whatever the case may be, may we ensure that we are doing everything we can to be that good soil in which the message of Jesus Christ takes root and yields a crop 160 or 30 times what was sown.